Well, good afternoon, and welcome again to Bay Presbyterian Church's look at some classic literature. I'm John Anderson, together with Mike Novak. Mike, when we were last together, we talked a bit about literature in general and how it is that literature, it's a subset of art, but how literature can reflect biblical themes even from a secular point of view. We said that mankind that is made in the image of God and therefore will naturally reflect some traits of God, though somewhat imperfectly because of man's fallen nature. There's a second reason why art and literature can reflect godly themes, and that's because, Mike, God has put eternity into man's heart, at least according to Solomon in Ecclesiastes. It is, in fact, a biblical theme. Therefore, that eternity works its way out and it shows up without even the artist or the authors even being aware of it. There's a third reason we said that art and literature reflect biblical themes, even secular artists and authors, and that's because nature screams out those themes, and that works its way out into the work product of the artist or the author. So, having briefly set the table thusly, Mike, I thought that we could follow up with that concept of a secular person's expression, artistic expression, or his literary expression, and see how that concept is applied. A very common theme in literature is the theme of good versus evil. The famed historian David McCullough said, "History is not the story of heroes entirely. It's often the story of cruelty and injustice and short-sightedness. There are monsters. There is evil. There is betrayal. That's why people should read Shakespeare and Dickens as well as history. They'll find the best, the worst, the height of noble attainment, and the depths of depravity." And a sterling display of the depths of depravity shows up in William Golding's classic novel, Lord of the Flies. Lord of the Flies is a good opening display of emergent biblical themes, particularly the theme of evil and sin and depravity, as the entire plot seems to be given to the persistent degeneration of its characters into their most base expression. Power, corruption, and murder, Lord of the Flies conjures thoughts of Samson and Jacob and David and some of their misadventures. Mike, why don't you just take it from here and walk us through maybe a little bit about Golding's background and some of what he accomplished during the course of his life, and then if you could tell us a little bit about the plot and the characters from this William Golding classic.
Yes, I'd be glad to, John. It's one of my favorite books, and I think we selected it because it is a challenging book. One doesn't think of it as a quote Christian book, and it isn't. It's a great novel, but by a secular author. And this secular author had an interesting background. I'd like to talk a little bit about William Golding before we get into the book. He was born in 1911. He was born into a family. His parents were atheists. Father was a school teacher, and Golding was well educated. Became a school teacher himself. Taught young boys. When World War II came along, Golding went into the British Navy, and this was a big change in his life. He experienced combat. He was part of the naval fleet that sank the German ship Bismarck. He participated in the Normandy invasion, and what he saw during the war really changed him. He saw the evil nature not only of the enemy but also of his own side, and he said this, "I began to see what people were capable of doing. Anyone who moved through those years without understanding that man produces evil as a bee produces honey must have been blind." So he has this kind of moral, spiritual trauma during the war. And he comes out and he resumes his school teaching for a number of years. And then he decides to write a book. In 1954, he wrote Lord of the Flies, which has become a 20th century classic. By the way, it was initially rejected by 20 different publishers. So all of you budding writers out there, don't despair. Even William Golding had trouble getting this great book published. He wrote about 12 novels, and many of them are allegorical. He is very concerned with issues of human nature and good and evil. He has many symbolic and moral meanings in his literal stories. So he was able to retire from teaching in 1961, and then he wrote full-time for the rest of his life. In 1983, he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature, and he was even knighted by the Queen of England. He became Sir William Golding, and then died in 1990. As far as we know, he was not or never became an Orthodox Christian. His biographers describe him in somewhat unsavory terms in his personal life. He was pretty hard on people. He drank heavily. But in his novels, he displays a deep understanding of biblical events and themes. And his novels are full of biblical allusions and quotes. He's especially, as I said, concerned with the problem of evil. So this book he wrote, Lord of the Flies, he did it in reaction to another book. There was a famous British novel from the 1850s called The Coral Island. And it's a typical young boy's novel of ripping yarn of three English boys who are shipwrecked on an island, and they're very triumphalist. They take charge and they do very well. They get along. They feed themselves. They build shelters, and it's just all very positive. They work harmoniously, one for all and all for one. By the end of the book, they've defeated a bunch of pirates, and they've converted the cannibals to Christianity. And Golding, after World War II, he had read the book as a young man, as many young boys had. He regarded the book as fundamentally false. He did not believe that's the way it would happen. So that's why he wrote Lord of the Flies. Now, Lord of the Flies is about a group of boys who are plane crashed on an island somewhere where it's very nice weather. They're schoolboys. They range between 8 and 14. Including a group of choir boys. There's about 24 of them on the island. So it's not just 3 little boys. And so there's this island. And it's tropical. It has plenty of food. It has fresh water and places for shelter. So that's the setup.
Let me just break in here for a second here, and let me ask you a question of the fact that this is taking place on an island, that these boys are found on an island. Do you make anything of the fact that Golding would choose an island as the setting for this adventure or misadventure of these young boys?
Well, I do. I think that Golding has an allegory up his sleeve in writing this book. And so I think he picked an island that had everything. Beautiful, clear, uninhabited, no adults, no institutions, just the boys. So he has this literary laboratory, if you will, where he intends to examine human nature. So it's kind of a Garden of Eden setting, and what man does to it.
Well, you talk about the island, and this is the sense that I had as I was reading this book. I had the fact that was on this island made me think of a polemic that Martin Luther had with Desiderius Erasmus, who was a Netherlands, a Dutch priest, and they were having this discussion back and forth, and they were discussing what exactly do you regard as grace. And Erasmus said, I believe that grace is two parents walking behind their 1-year-old child as he's learning how to walk so they can catch him so he won't get hurt. That is grace. And Luther responded, and he said, no. Grace is a caterpillar in a ring of fire. And I kind of had that picture of an island being that ring of fire that they're in, and how will they get rescued? And Luther says that in a caterpillar in a ring of fire, there's only one way to get rescued, and that's from above. Mm-hmm. And so as I read this novel, I kept on finding myself thinking, well, how are they going to get rescued? How is that going to take place? They're not going to be able to rescue themselves. How's that going to happen?
Well, we won't do a spoiler alert right now.
Okay.
We'll tell them at the end.
All right.
What happens? But that is a great theme, and I do think that Golding really did have a goal for several levels of the knowledge, and that notion of isolation. He talked later on in an interview why he had no adults and no girls on the island. He did not want his message to be spoiled by the complications of sex, if that's would be involved. He just wanted these little boys. And he also did that because he said, I was a boy, I was a brother, I was a father, I taught little boys, and I know they're not angels. And so he said they were the perfect laboratory for this book, so to speak. So they're on this island. There's the implication that there's an atomic war going on because they're we'll get into that in a minute, but there is that implication that they were evacuating or something from a war scene. No other people. Well, no existing social institutions. They are set there to invent. And the question is, what happens because of their own natures? Mm-hmm. And as we'll see, it doesn't go as well as the Coral Island book did. Before we get into the going through the brief description of the plot, I just want to say that there were 2 movies made of this book. There was one made in 1963, 9 years after the book came out, and was done by English actors and directors, and it's really quite a good movie. It's in black and white. It's very true to the book, but no movie can take the place of a book. So I don't mean to be a Miss Grundy here, to tell you don't look at the movie, don't look at the classics illustrate, read the book. Well, the book is much better because movies can't capture the depth of the psychological and spiritual and moral conflicts that are going on that the author describes in the characters. The second movie, came out in 1990, and it was made by Hollywood. It is a typical Hollywood production. It is shallow, focuses on violence in the book. It puts in a whole bunch of foul language that's not in the book. It's poorly acted. It's really a wretched movie, and I hope nobody waits an hour and a half of their time seeing it. But the 1963 version is very good. It's actually free. It's on YouTube if you're interested. And also on YouTube is some interviews with William Golding, so you can get the flavor of his personality too. So here's a statement of the theme, of a very good theme statement from a critic before we describe the plot. He said, Golding was not an Orthodox Christian, but he wrote about universal themes, moral responsibility, good and evil in man, original sin, civilization and barbarism, and conflicts, all themes that are deeply rooted in Western civilization. Golding attempts to explore the situation around us. We mentioned in our previous introductory session that these are good things for Christians to know better, and that they can learn through literature that makes them a better witness for Christ. Be able to understand people in this way and what motivates them, both good and evil. So, should we just talk about a little bit of?
Let me just break in at that point, and when you say about how it sharpens us, if you will, for our ability to communicate with folks around us on the issue of relevance. Now, I think sometimes relevance is overblown, but I can remember a missions professor from Westminster, Dr. Harvey Kahn. He did a series of lectures called Winning the Auca Indians of Southern California. And of course, the Auca Indians were not they were in Ecuador. They were not in Southern California. But his point was that there's a culture that surrounds us. It's a pagan culture. The Auca Indians happen to be cannibals, and it's not that they're literally cannibals surrounding us, but it is a hostile environment that we live in to our faith. And these any artistic expression is really a window into the culture around us, and that's the point I think that you're trying to make, is that that any little window that we can gain into the lives of the people around us is important, because it helps us speak truth into that culture.
That's exactly the point. That I totally agree. I think the key word there is truth. Great artists like Anton Chekhov has said that the artist is pursuing truth, and our God is a God of truth. So when we read a good book, we recognize that something true is being said about these people and these ideas and their relationship with each other and perhaps with God. We recognize something that's true. It reinforces us as Christians.
You know, if I could just extrapolate a little bit on this too, because I think we touched on it last week, but this is a good illustration of that fact, that we said that there are, not strictly speaking, but there's kind of, and Francis Schaeffer talked about this a little bit, about being three levels of truth. There's ultimate truth, God's truth up here. And then we have a layer of people, layer is a strong word, but we have people who understand that truth and interpret it for us. And then the rest of us, we hear these interpretations, and these interpretations comes through art, comes through theology, comes through philosophy, and we can get glimpses of this truth to a greater or lesser degree through the artist, the philosopher, the theologian, the pastor, who is helping us interpret the truth. The interesting thing is that Friedrich Nietzsche one time said that there is no truth, only interpretation. Now, Nietzsche is a century old, so he probably didn't have a window into what we call the post-Christian era or postmodernism. And yet, that's what he was expressing. The fact that there's no absolute truth, that everything's just an interpretation of that truth. And yet, what we're saying is that there is an absolute truth. And sometimes the artist or the author is going to stumble into that truth and express it.
Even when he's not a believer, like Golding. I mean, Golding is really interested in the true nature of human beings and their relations with each other. And if it's an artist with integrity, they can't help but stumble into those biblical expressions of what man is.
Well, listen, I got us off track. Why don't you bring us back on track and talk about the plot?
That's right. We do have a book here.
Yeah,
and
let's talk about that.
So we have these plane wreck boys on this island. They do try to establish some kind of civilized society on the island. And of course, it doesn't go well. But there are four main characters in the book, and they're kind of archetypes. Um, in other words, models, patterns of certain types of people that exist in every society. There's Ralph, who is a reasonably good, trustworthy older boy and a natural leader. There is Jack, another older boy, leader of the choir boys, and leader of the hunters. And he is not a cooperator. He also resents the other boy's leadership. The third major character is a character they call Piggy. We never learn his real name. He's a little fat boy they pick on, who wears thick glasses and has asthma, and he's rather annoying, but he is also a wise person. He is the one who comes up with the idea that they use a large shell to light representative government possibly as a type. And then the fourth character is a boy named Simon, who's a little bit more different. But he is a very sweet-natured, quiet boy, thoughtful, insightful, and very visionary and understanding, and very brave. And he is Golding's main character, as it turns out, in the book. And I'll say it right now, Golding in an interview after the book was published said that Simon was his Christ figure. He specifically said that, not just a prophet or a visionary, but so he would be my husband. Well, things break down because, and I'm going to tell a plot of this here, the rules stop being followed. Jack, who's breaks away, breaks all the rules, doesn't like being a leader, and most of the boys defect to his tribe. Once again, and they hunt, they start painting their faces like savages, they're no longer wearing their clothes, and unfortunately the biggest part of their civilizing activity, which was to keep a signal fire so they could be rescued, they let the fire go out because they're busy playing and feasting and all of this. The other thing that happens is they see something on the top of the mountain that's moving around up there, and it scares them. And they start imagining all kinds of things, and they get very superstitious, and they decide it's a beast. There's a beast on the island. They're very afraid of it. Well, one day these hunters are out and they kill a pig and they cut its head off and put it on a stake, and they make an offering to the beast to try to placate the beast. And of course this is a metaphor not only of savagery but of pagan idol worship and so forth. And so this pig head is on this stake, and there's flies all buzzing around it. And this is where Golding first mentions the phrase, it was the Lord of the Flies.
You know, I found out something interesting about the fact that he did name the book, the novel, Lord of the Flies, because this is a relatively small piece. There's a larger theme involved, but the actual discovery of the Lord of the Flies, if you will, is really kind of a small piece in it. And actually it has biblical roots. And that's the reason why I originally went back to read this, was because I was doing a Bible study in 1 Kings. And in 1 Kings it mentions Beelzebub. And I looked in the column and found out that Beelzebub means Lord of the Flies. And I thought, well, I need to read Lord of the Flies again. But it's a biblical character. It has to do with one of the characterizations of a Canaanite god called Baal. And this is Baal-zebub. This is Baal means Lord. and of the flies, but Beelzebub, and that's how we get this name. So it has a biblical root in it, and I just find it interesting that a person that has no pretense of a Christian faith would find a biblical root for this.
Yeah,
in the title.
I think Golding found it very easy to believe in Satan. I do. Well, so Simon realizes that they're in crisis, and he dresses the boys. They meet, and he says, "There may not be any beast. Maybe it's only us," he says to them. This 10-year-old boy, he says. Well, they don't buy all that. So Simon himself is not afraid. He decides, I'm going up to the top of that mountain and see what's going on. He climbs up, and he finds that there's a dead body up there. It's the pilot of the plane, and it's his parachute that's blowing back and forth. And it's not a beast. So he cuts it loose, and the wind carries it out to sea. So that goes away, and Simon starts back down the mountain to tell the boys the good news. And he's coming down the mountain, and he stops at the pig's head, and he looks at the pig's head, and he hears a voice, and the pig's head is speaking to him. And Golding describes this very ambiguously. It could be a voice, it could be a voice in Simon's head, it could be a temptation of Satan. We don't know. But the pig talks to him.
Well, do you have some quotes about that?
I do.
Okay.
Let me just read that.
All right. And then I have a follow-up question on that.
Yeah. Let's see where it is. Okay. So the pig's head is supposedly saying to him, "Aren't you afraid of me?" And Simon looks back at him and says, "You're just a pig's head on a stick." Well, the voice keeps up, and it says, "Fancy thinking the beast was something you could hunt and kill," said the head. "But you knew, didn't you? I'm part of you. Close, close, close. I'm the reason why it's no go, why things are what they are." And so Simon is taken aback and a bit shocked and wobbled by this. And then the head says to him, "You know perfectly well you'll only meet me down there, so don't try to escape." And then Simon faints. So this is a key apparition.
And would you call this a turning point in the book? Is this where are we in the plot now?
Well, I think that Golding meant this is the climax. This is the spiritual climax of the book. This is the great insight of the book. There are other things that are going to happen that people might regard as climactic, but I do think that this is what Golding was attempting to show, is that the revelation to Simon about the evil in men's hearts. It's something that Simon suspected as a precocious boy, and this vision that he has confirms him. So he wants to go back down the hill and bring the good news to the other boys, to say, first of all, that beast you thought up there was dead pilot, don't worry. And maybe the other good news is the evil is us. We've got the evil issue. It's our own behavior. It's not anything outside of us. So this is the Christ figure notion. So he's coming back down the hill. Meanwhile, all the other boys, it's getting dark. It's gotten dark, and they're having a feast. They're roasting a pig, fire on the beach. They're dancing around the fire in a frenzy of savagery, screaming and yelling with their spears. And Simon comes out of the bushes, and the boys are frightened. They see somebody coming out of the bushes, and one of the boys yells, "It's the beast!" And they all run over and they start stabbing him. And they kill Simon. And Simon's body is washed out to sea. The next day, Ralph and Piggy, the two remaining good guys, go over to the other tribe to try to make peace and to try to talk this through. And while they're doing it, you know, Piggy is lecturing them as he does. He's a bit of a schoolmarmy kind of kid. About we've got to keep the signal fire going. We've got to follow the rules. And in other words, all the arguments of civilized society. And while he's doing that, one of the boys up on top rolls a boulder on him, knocks him down the cliff, and he falls down the cliff. He's killed. And at that point, Ralph realizes it's all over, and Ralph runs into the island. The other boys chase him with their spears. They start a fire to flush him out. And what might be called the climactic scene, if it were merely a literary plot, is Ralph crawling out of the bushes onto the beach, and the other boys screaming and yelling with the whole island up in flames coming after him. And at that point, Ralph looks up, and it's a naval officer standing on the beach.
Okay, so now he has a naval officer, and I suppose could you call this naval officer a savior? I mean, Simon was probably in Golding's mind he was the savior, but would you call this, because after all the sea captain kept him from being killed?
Well, I'm happy to give you a clear answer on that, John, and the answer is yes and no.
Oh, well, thanks for being definitive about it.
Sure. The officer prevents Ralph from being killed, and no doubt they'll be moved out to the ship. But let me read you two remaining pieces here. First of all, the officer is shocked to see these boys. English officer. He looks at them, finds out two of them are dead, and he says, "I should have thought that a pack of British boys would have been able to put up a better show than this. I mean," and he's embarrassed for them. And Ralph said, "Well, at first it was going well," and the officer said, "Oh, I know, jolly good show, like Coral Island." And Ralph looks up at the island being scorched. The ship had seen the island burning down, came to rescue them. Simon was dead. The tears began to flow and sobs shook him. This is Ralph. And he gave himself up to them for the first time on the island. Great shuddering spasms of grief that wrenched his whole body. His voice rose under the black smoke before the burning wreckage of the island, made the other little boys shake and cry too. Ralph wept for the end of innocence, the darkness of man's heart, and the fall through the air of the true wise friend called Piggy. And then the last two sentences of the book. The officer, surrounded by the noises, was moved and embarrassed. He turned away to give them time to pull themselves together and waited, allowing his eyes to rest out on the trim cruiser in the distance. So this is the no part. What are they being rescued to? They're being rescued to a warship that is in love with.
So really, it's kind of like out of the frying pan into the fire. They're sucked in by their own depravity on the island, and they're rescued, if you will, only to go to the depravity of the adults off the island.
Yes, and that's as far as Golding got in his life, because he was a spiritual pessimist. The wars traumatized him, and he felt, civilization is a thin veneer, and look at what mankind is doing to the world. Back in the 50s it was, and we still do have this notion that we have the power to blow up God's creation. So his answer is no hope.
Mm.
Or he leaves it at that. He's not explicit, but it appears to Golding that there's no hope.
Mm. Mm.
And that is his statement of this book. One other thing I would point out about the book is that Golding rejects the worldview you were referring to earlier that has resulted in postmodernism. The Rousseauistic notion that man is basically good and it's exterior things that corrupt him. Society, institutions, the Marxist notion that it's not enough fairly distributed goods, all of that stuff. And Golding said, no, really, it's what John Calvin said about the human heart that's depraved. Or what the Bible said, and Calvin reiterated, it's the human heart that's depraved.
You know, that's really a remarkable confession for someone to make, because nowadays, I mean, now of course we're 70 years downstream from this, but nowadays it's blame everything else around you. It's everything but yourself. And here we're Golding, who was anything but a Bible-believing Christian man, is identifying the evil as being from within and human depravity.
Yes, I think he was doing what Shakespeare said that art is supposed to do, hold the mirror up to nature. And that was Golding's view of what human nature is and what it's capable of when it turns itself over totally to evil.
Yeah. I'd like to close our time together here with a quote from Mark Twain. Now, again, Mark Twain would never be confused with a churchman. But Mark Twain said, "I've been reading the morning paper. I do it every morning, knowing well that I shall find in it the usual depravities and baseness and hypocrisy and cruelties that make up civilization, and cause me to put in the rest of the day pleading for the damnation of the human race. I cannot seem to get my prayers answered. Yet I do not despair." And as we think about what Golding wrote and how he wrote about a worldview that saw the depravity of man with no salvation, nobody breaking into the ring of fire, nobody reaching down to rescue from above. The only rescue that there was, put them back in the fire, quite literally, as they were going into an atomic war. Yet there was another one, Dostoevsky, who would write a book, The Brothers Karamazov, which was which telegraphs something a little bit different. He agreed with the premise of Golding, which is that man is inherently sinful, as you mentioned, Calvin and now Golding, two great theologians. And but Dostoevsky goes a little step further, because Dostoevsky offers the promise of hope. And it's of that hope that we will discuss the next time we're together, and we'll talk about the Brothers Karamazov. In the meantime, Mike, thank you very much for that good look at The Lord of the Flies. We commend this book as an interesting book, not as a theological tome. It's not a self-help book, but I think you'll find it an interesting read, and we would commend it to you.
Yes.
Okay, thanks for being with us.